One of the most common questions that I see on my videos is which combination of amp and DAC is best, and that's tricky to answer on many levels. The synergy between devices is a really interesting thing. Some amps just sing with certain DACs, whilst other combinations seem to steal each other's magic. Of course, some devices sound good with anything, but it can be a hard, long, and expensive road to make these discoveries for yourself. The good news is that there's a simple solution. For a long time, I was using the Chord Hugo TT2 as my all-in-one desktop solution as DAC, preamp, and headphone amp. At around about $6,000 though, the TT2 is not a product for the masses. I know that affordability is a very personal question, but I tend to think that around about $1,500 for a DAC and $1,500 for an amplifier is a generally achievable kind of level if you want to save up, put the time aside, be a little bit patient, and get just what you're after. That is, of course, if you're really serious about getting the best possible music reproduction that you can buy. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that you have to spend that much money, but the point is that a $3,000 DAC and headphone amp or preamp combination could easily be an endgame solution for many people. A while back now, Burson Audio delivered what I thought was a fantastic all-in-one solution in the form of the Burson Audio Conductor GT3 or GT. The GT was single-ended, the GT3 was balanced. It was a great, cheaper alternative to the Chord TT2. It wasn't quite as good, but it got you a long way towards the sound of the TT2, and being an all-in-one unit, it had the benefit of being all in a single chassis. However, the amplifier in the Conductor GT3 was at a slightly lower level than the quality offered by Burson's own Soloist GT amplifiers, and that could lead some people wanting more. If only somebody could find a way to deliver a truly epic DAC and headphone amp / preamp combination in a single, sleek, compact box that didn't compromise the sound of the DAC or the headphone amp / preamp and didn't cost as much as the TT2. That'd be brilliant. Well, someone did. The Burson Audio Conductor GT4 takes everything that was great about the original GT3 and improves upon it. It takes the same basic DAC architecture that was in the GT3, but one key area of improvement here is that the individual ES9038 DAC chips are now independently powered. They've got a separate power supply for each DAC chip. That keeps the left and right channels of audio completely separate from the moment the digital signal enters either the USB, coaxial, optical, or Bluetooth inputs on the DAC. And that goes all the way from the DAC chips to the front outputs into your headphones or the rear outputs into your speakers or preamp. And the performance of both types of output, whether it's the headphone amp or the preamp, are identical. And that's pretty lucky. If we're being honest about it, the GT3 didn't really need an improved DAC stage. It was already awesome. The one weak point of the GT3, if you can even call it that, was that the amplifier was not quite as good as the standalone Soloist GT amplifier. The Conductor GT3 was and is a fantastic DAC, headphone amp and preamp, but the Soloist GT amplifier was always sitting there off to the side, reminding you that things could be just a little bit better. Well, not anymore. Thanks to the compact design of Burson Audio's max current power supplies, they can now fit multiple power supply units inside the same chassis and still have space for the full Soloist GT amplification circuit. In other words, you're now getting Burson Audio's best DAC along with their best headphone amplifier and preamplifier circuit. Now yes, there is still the Burson Voyager amp now to remind you that things can get even better still, but that's also pushing up into another tier of pricing, and it's at a level where I wouldn't necessarily recommend the Voyager unless you've got a truly top tier DAC to go with it. Something like a Chord TT2, a Chord Dave, a Denafrips Terminator, DACs that are operating at that truly top tier level. For any other DAC built on a foundation of ESS, Cirrus Logic, or AKM chips without the benefit of custom filters, I think the Soloist GT is about as good as you need to go. And that's because it's already exceptional. And so now the Conductor GT4 brings you that level of amplification along with a fantastic DAC in a very compact, sleek case, considering what's in it. What that all means is a power output of up to 5 watts into a 32 ohm load, but also a quiet enough amp that you can use it with IEMS too. The volume matching is all digital, so it provides perfect channel balance all the way down to the bottom of the range, and the low gain mode gives you just enough volume range to get the most out of most IEMs, unless you're a super quiet listener. And that's especially true if you connect to the 6.3mm output instead of the XLR output. And don't worry, they sound basically identical. So, is it the perfect device? End of review? Not quite, we need to discuss that a bit more. The first thing you'll want to know is the price of the Conductor GT4, and there are 3 different levels. The base version comes in at $2,799 US, and that's actually cheaper than what the old Conductor GT and GT3 came in at. That's pretty cool that you're getting more for less. But you might be wanting even more again, and the temptation of the next 2 levels of the GT4 is real. By jumping up to the $600 US Deluxe version, you're going to go from the V6 Vivids up to the V7 Vivid op amps, but it also gets you the upgraded power supply control chips that are called the Silent Power 2 or SP2 modules. But as they say, wait, there's more, because you also get the supercharger wall wart power supply. Power supply skeptics might be thinking that there's no point in paying extra for power supply upgrades, but I've discussed each of these upgrades separately in different videos, and what I can tell you is that the massive reduction in power supply noise that's possible with these upgrades delivers a sound that's more spacious, it's smoother, and it offers better imaging accuracy as well. In short, it's quite transformative. But I can't get into all of that in this video because it'll end up 3 hours long. And that's because we still need to talk about the next tier up again with the Conductor GT4. And that's where you add another $600 US and you get the new Fusion Core power supply. The Fusion Core is large and expensive, but wow. Like with any power supply upgrade, the Fusion Core is not going to do as much for you as buying an upgraded component, like a DAC, an amp, a headphone amp, etc. In other words, adding the Fusion Core to a lower level DAC like Burson's own Composer DAC isn't going to suddenly turn that DAC into a competitor for the GT4. But if you're starting at the level of the Conductor GT4, the Fusion Core is an impressive upgrade. And it's doubly impressive when you consider the fact that when you add the Fusion Core to the Conductor GT4, what you're doing is you're improving the power supply for both the DAC and the headphone amp or preamp in your system. I'll do a separate video about the Fusion Core and why and how it improves the sound of audio devices. But for now, we need to talk about the listening experience with the Conductor GT4 because I've been talking about specs and features and different tiers of pricing for way too long. The first thing I noticed about the GT4's sound is that there's a purity to it. Everything sounds just right and not at all like a normal Delta Sigma DAC. Timbre and tonality is perfect from top to bottom. There's no glare, no edge, no sense of enhancement, just a natural and very resolving sound via either the headphone outputs or the rear preamp outputs. On that note, as I said before, it doesn't matter whether you use the 4-pin XLR or the 6.3mm output on the front, barring the very slight differences you might get from the different connector types, being a 6.3mm with a common ground versus the 4-pin XLR with completely separate channels. Other than the hint of crosstalk you might get with the 6.3mm connector, both outputs are identically impressive, and the power output levels from the Conductor GT4 means you can drive anything you want from either output. There's also the 3.5mm headset jack for gaming use or comms use, and that's going to accept a TRRS plug where you can also have your microphone going into the Burson Conductor GT4, and that's going to provide audio output for your gaming or your video calls or whatever you're using it for, as well as receiving the microphone input and sending it directly into your computer. So suddenly the Conductor GT4 is also probably the most insanely capable gaming and comms DAC you could ever imagine buying. So the GT4 is a wonderful sounding DAC, headphone amp and preamp. That's pretty clear so far, but I haven't even plugged in the Fusion Core yet. Adding the Fusion Core maintained all of the fantastic audio goodness I've already spoken about, but it opened it up further in terms of things like soundstage space and the focus and placement of each individual instrument in space. On Take Me Home, the sound of the crowd clapping stretched a little bit wider out. It actually went a little bit beyond my ears with headphones. That's once the Fusion cord was added. But going beyond that, the specific differences between using, say, the supercharger power supply and the Fusion cord power supply get a little bit tricky to describe. And it's because it's all quite subtle, but it's also all-encompassing. Literally everything gets a little bit better going to the Fusion core. There's more space in the sound. You can hear more subtle details. And it's also a smoother sound across the board, but not richer or warmer, just smoother and more refined. So you're getting just as much detail, maybe even more, but with a more refined delivery. This is all sounding pretty good, isn't it? Well, let's talk about the flies in the ointment, and there are two. Firstly, depending on your amplifier setup, the Conductor GT4 might create some pops through your speaker system. It doesn't seem to do this through the headphone outputs, but through a set of monoblocks that I've been running for testing, it did create some pops when I switched the GT4 on and off. But that was possibly because the monoblocks were already powered on each time, and the GT4 thankfully offers multiple 12-volt trigger outputs, and that means it can switch on and off your monoblocks or your power amp whenever you turn the Conductor GT4 on or off. And that will hopefully help by delaying the initial onset of amplification until after the pop comes out of the Conductor GT4. But if you're not using the 12-volt triggers for some reason and you're permanently leaving the amplification switched on, it is worth being aware that you might get some pops. The pop is a little bit annoying, but I should be clear that it's not loud enough to cause any damage to anything other than the peaceful serenity before you start your music. And that brings us to the other fly in the ointment. You see, there's lots of other devices on the market that do exactly what the GT4 does, and sometimes more. For example, the FiiO K19 does everything that the Conductor GT4 does in terms of features. It also costs a bunch less and brings other powerful features like DSP, including dynamic range control. It's also got USB to SPDIF conversion if you want to daisy chain your devices, and it's even got HDMI ARC for using with a TV type setup. In short, the K19 appears to be way better value. Initially, when you listen to both devices, the differences aren't that large, but then you spend a bit more time across a few more tracks. And the GT4 starts to pull ahead and build its lead as every moment of listening goes on. The first things that I noticed were the nuances in the guitar and vocals in Slow Dancing in a Burning Room. Those were much more evident from the GT4. There are subtleties and inflections from the sound of the guitars and the vocals that are just more lifelike and more detailed from the Conductor GT4. Admittedly, you won't hear some of these differences without high-end headphones or speakers, but I also wouldn't recommend that you buy the GT4 unless you're running high-end headphones or speakers. At about 1 minute 50 in Slow Dancing, there's a short 3-note descending fill on the guitar, and it's got a delicacy and a subtlety from the Conductor GT4 that allows it to just kind of hang there in space. The short solo that follows does the same thing. On the K19, those notes are more two-dimensional. They blend in with the rest of the mix. And the result is that it's not an experience hearing it from the K19 in the way it is from the Conductor GT4. It's nice, it's fine, but it doesn't immerse you in the experience like you're almost there with the musicians. The Conductor GT4 does that. Something else that's worth noting is that if you've been listening to the GT4 and then you return to the K19, it's a little bit like that feeling you get when you've finished an amazing holiday and you have to come back to the day-to-day drudgery and chores of normal life. On the K19, the soundstage shrinks, the magic evaporates, and you're left with a solid but generally unremarkable sound once you've gotten to the GT4's presentation. That's especially true if you're paying attention to soundstage depth, but it's true across the board with things like soundstage width, soundstage depth, and even separation and specific placement of instruments. That's not to say that the K19 is bad, it's a lot cheaper, but it goes to show how much the GT4 can elevate your listening experience if you've got a great set of headphones or speakers after it. What you might also want to know is that the amplification and preamplification stage in the GT4 is actually as good as the Soloist GT. When using the same combination of op amps, silent power modules and power supplies, and of course matching volume levels, The GT4 on its own sounds just as good as using the GT4 as a DAC only and feeding out to the Soloist GT headphone amp. You can of course also use the amplification and preamplification stage within the GT4 for other inputs, but it is worth being aware that the GT4 uses the ES9038 DAC chips to resample the audio and create a digital volume control. So that means that whatever you feed into the 4 analog inputs on the back of the Conductor GT4 is going to be resampled to give you volume control. In other words, the GT4 is not going to retain the analog purity coming from your turntable if that's what you're looking for. For digital sources, it's not really going to make much of a difference. And so generally speaking, the Conductor GT4 is going to sound fantastic as an amp or preamp for whatever's upstream from it. But if it is something that produces a specifically larger soundstage than what the ES9038 DAC chips are capable of, it might compress the soundstage a little bit. So again, we're talking about things like a higher end DAC, such as a Chord TT2 or a Dave, maybe an R2R DAC like a Denafrips Terminator, or of course a purely analog setup like a turntable. And now on that note, I said something in my recent review of the Shelly Labs Daisy DAC. If you're building a flagship DAC today, in my opinion, unless you're going to be doing something with custom filters, you need to begin with the AK449 as the center DAC chip. And while I stand by that statement, the sound of the GT4 is about as good as I can imagine anybody getting the ES9038 DAC chips to sound. And so I was actually curious to see just how close it could get to the Daisy. Would a Daisy running Sparko's op amps and then a separate Soloist headphone amp and preamp be a better choice than just buying the Conductor GT4? Interestingly, the output from the Conductor GT4 is significantly higher than from the Daisy and required a little bit of level matching. Once matched, the GT4 is definitely a flatter presentation in terms of soundstage, but that's about the only area that it falls short of the Daisy to my ears. The GT4's sound is just as refined and just as rich, perhaps even more so than the Daisy. And again, when I'm saying rich, it doesn't mean smooth, smoothed off, or thick. All of the detail and resolution is still there, it's just delivered with a more pleasing overall feel. The flatter soundstage from the GT4 actually produces the impression initially that it's giving you more detail and more resolution, but the reality is when you listen to the Daisy, the details are there, they're just not pushed forward at you as much. And so ultimately, if you're not craving the absolute maximum amount of depth and layering in the soundstage that you can get around this price point, the convenience of having a smaller single box solution in the form of the Conductor GT4 is compelling. I think the Daisy probably can net you slightly better sound thanks to the improved soundstage presentation, but you'll be spending as much as or more than what you pay for a full fat GT4 by the time you buy the Daisy and the op amps and a great headphone amplifier. And then of course you've got things like analog interconnects to think about as well. In the end, both products have their own features and benefits to think about, and both are great options depending on the use case. And speaking of amazing options, Burson have knocked another one out of the park here. Perhaps not class leading because of the slightly reduced soundstage depth coming from the ES9038 chip as opposed to an AK4499 setup, but regardless of that, as a DAC alone, it's already a 9 out of 10. And then you have an onboard headphone amp that will drive any headphone you can think of, act as an exceptional preamp for your speaker system, and even connect up a headset for gaming or communications. The Burson Audio Conductor GT3 was already good. The Conductor GT4 offers an incredible single box audiophile solution. And so if you're keen to own something like that for yourself, I've got a link in the description below. If you're not ready to spend quite that much money, but you are looking for a fantastic all-in-one solution, I've linked my review of the K19 up here. For now, I want to say a huge thanks to channel members, to channel Patreon members, and to those of you that leave super thanks on videos like this one. And in the meantime, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.